actually since last DevCon, because admissions asked about nothing that simply wasn't possible. So I started rewriting it, I gave up on it, and I picked it up again and finished it someday. Yeah, so just an overview what we actually want to have in the end. We have sections, like if you go into settings, you have appearance, I don't know, video, music. These are kind of hard-coded because you have actual window IDs for every section. Not much to do there. We have every section has different categories. That's the labels you have on the left side if you go into a section. Like, I don't know, audio output, display, internet access, whatever. You can actually have as many as you want, but the space is kind of limited, so you can't have as many as you want. And then you have groups. It's simply just a bunch of settings separated by a white line from the other settings. And then you have the settings. You have different kind of settings. You have Boolean settings, full check mark. You have numbers, strings, paths, add-ons. Yeah, they're all bound to a specific control type in the UI. You get a list, you get a spinner, you get a text input. You need range values. Some values only have valid range like 1 to 100, or I don't know, or choose from resolution 180p, 70p, like this. And changing a setting most likely leads to a lot of action in the background, which needs to be handled. So that's just what we want, basically. Now we look at the old implementation. Was simply everything was C++ code, a lot of method calls. If you wanted to add a section, you called add section. Then you called add category, everything in the same function. You had a list of, I don't know, maybe 400 lines of code for every setting. You had add bool, add int, add string, and every line was like this long, so you had to scroll in your editor to see the whole thing. Add separator for if you want to group settings together. Well, one of the problems is you change a setting, you have to recompile the whole thing. You just change the range from 1 to 50 to 1 to 100, and you have to recompile XBMC just because you had to adjust something. It's pretty difficult to read these add bool, add int, because there's like for add string, I think there were like 10 overloaded methods, and finding the right one or seeing which one is used wasn't always easy. Yeah, you can't really extend it because you have to write the setting definition in that method in Gui settings.cpp. So if we ever want to allow add-ons to add settings to our settings screen, we will pretty much screw. The persistence is pretty basic. We have Gui settings.xml. It's simply key value storage. And there's also some non-GUI settings in there, which are somewhere mixed in because they don't fit anywhere else. We have advanced settings, which allows overriding values from GUI settings permanently. And there's profiles, sources, RSS feed, lots of other XML files, which all contain some kind of settings. Yeah, there's a lot of different files to load. Especially GUI settings with the mixed content is not very easy to handle. You can't just write the file, you have to write it, then pass it on, write again, and then you have to take care of not overwriting stuff from before. But we really don't want to change this stuff because every user has a GUI settings.xml where all this stuff is in there, and we don't really want to kill that. So I tried, or I had to keep this the way it is or was. Yeah, the old implementation used a global instance class, like we use everywhere, of C GUI settings, which simply defines all the settings, loads them, and saves them. Then there's C settings, which loads C GUI settings, initializes it, writes the other settings that don't really are GUI settings into GUI settings, and loads all the other files that I mentioned earlier. So it's kind of a wrapper around C GUI settings with additional code. And then there's C GUI Windows settings category, which I had to shorten so it fits on the screen later on, which is responsible for the whole GUI stuff that the user sees. And unfortunately, it's also responsible for handling any action that happens when you change a setting. So if you enable the web server, that GUI class takes care of starting the web server and whatever happens if it doesn't work, which is not really ideal because it doesn't really have to do anything with the web server, and you needed code for every setting. You had to write an if, blah blah blah, then else, next setting, else, and you had an if-else block which was incredibly large, and it was really difficult to have any overview over what happened when you change the setting, or if you wanted to hide a setting when the value of another setting changed. Yeah, it was basically madness. Yeah, I think I already said that you had to code everything manually in there.
Yeah,
that's what I just said.
With the full spinners and
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the last point is actually what AdVisions asked last year about. They wanted to change the setting from JSON RPC or from Python, but it doesn't really work because the logic in C GUI Windows settings category was written that you can only change a setting from the user interface. You can't change it from anywhere else. So if you change the skin somewhere in XBMC code, you also had to write the action to reload the skin, even though the logic was already present somewhere, but you can't call it, you can't use it. So you had to duplicate this logic everywhere you change the setting on the fly. Well, so some ideas for the new implementation. Yeah, actually decoupling the settings definition and displaying of the settings, so you can change the definition without having to touch any GUI code, which wasn't possible before. Yeah, exactly what I just said. Also being able to change settings from anywhere, including Python, JSON, RPC, whatever we will have in the future, without having to duplicate any existing code. We have multiple settings levels, which is a lot of discussion right now. So I'll skip over that. Yeah, extendable through add-ons. Yes?
Does Python and JSON RPC currently have the ability to
Not
access
yet.
and change settings?
I didn't have the time to code it up, but it's not really, in Python you have like two methods, get setting, set setting. It's not really that much code, just someone has to write.
Right, it'll be nice when we have
So
that.
in 2 days we have it.
I suspect we'll see a lot of auto configuration wizards
Yeah.
popping up.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah, that would be.
I know that OpenLet has one, and I looked, and I think it just modifies GUI settings.xml directly, which is.
And it enforces a reload or something.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
some completely hacked.
As usual. So yeah, the new setting system still uses, okay, now the setting definition happens in an XML file. It's a bit easier to read than the 10 overloaded add string method. It's pretty, there's a lot of text in there, but it's just easier to read. You can just, I have a few examples later. You have a default file, settings.xml, where you can throw in all your settings definitions. Then you have platform-specific settings definition files like linux.xml, where you can hide settings that you don't want to be available on Linux, or you can add additional settings that only are needed on Linux and not on OS X or Windows or whatever. And if any appliance like OpenLet or whatever wants to add their own settings, they can throw them into appliance.xml without having to touch the original settings.xml. and the settings will still appear in the user interface just as if they were in settings.xml. So it should make it easier for keyboards or whatever to add some custom settings without having to touch the rest of the code. Yeah, that's just that. Yeah, and you don't have to recompile XBMC if you just change the default value of that setting or whatever you change it there. Here's an example how the file looks like. You have the root element settings, then you have a section. Every section has every element basically has an ID, which is unique among section has unique IDs among sections. Category has unique IDs among categories. And you have a label and a help string, which is displayed at the bottom of the user interface, which should make it a bit easier for users to know what a setting actually does, because we have really badly named settings. You have, like I said, settings, categories, groups, and then settings. Settings have a type in addition to the ID label type. That's just the basic skeleton. The ID must be unique, label type. Yeah, you can add new sections, whatever, in the additional XML files like linux.xml. If you think you need a new category which is not available, normally you just add it in another file and it will appear in the user interface. You can even say where you want to put it. So if you want to put it specifically between, I don't know, audio output and video output, you can do that. You can say you want to have after video output, and it will appear there. Just have to pass in the ID of the other category that you reference. It also works for groups, it works for, I'm not sure if it works for settings. Yeah, it works for settings. You can also override specific values. So if you have a different default value of Linux than you have on Windows, you just set a different value in the linux.xml for that setting, and it will take it over. So it's much easier to see the platform-specific stuff by simply looking into that file. You don't really have to read through the code and search for some if the Linux, else if the Windows. You just look in the right file and you see all the values there. And there are some global elements that are available for categories, sections, groups, and settings. One of them is visible. This allows you to hide a certain group, setting, or whatever for a specific platform. So if you don't want to see the, I don't know, internet access on the Raspberry Pi, you simply say visible false in the Raspberry Pi.xml and you won't see it anymore. But you will still see it on all the other platforms. You have requirements. These are basically the has DirectX, has OpenGL, has whatever mapped to XML strings. And you can do any arbitrary combination of and or nested as deeply as you want. As an example, a requirement has zeroconf, so the setting will only be visible if zeroconf is available.
It's the AirPlay setting, isn't it?
Sorry?
It's the AirPlay setting, isn't it?
No, it's the zeroconf setting. But it's also there for the AirPlay setting, a bit more complicated. Or, like I said, the combination of and or, you can say it has to be has GL or has DirectX, and you can do and you can nest it as far as you want. Now let's look at the settings themselves, the different setting properties. You can define a parent setting. Simply what it does is you get a hyphen in front of the label so that you see that it's kind of belongs to the setting above it. Makes it a bit easier. The label is still simply, I don't know, web server port. You don't have to put the hyphen in the string.xml or whatever you use now.
Is the intentional logic for sub settings, did this Can this be changed in skins, or it is like hard-coded, the hyphen in front?
It's hard-coded right now, I think. Is it hard-coded, the hyphen?
I think it would be cool if skins could change the way subsettings
Yeah, it's
are
hard-coded.
displayed.
Yeah, yeah. That's an idea, yeah, we can do that.
You make it some kind of graphic or
Yeah, sure.
just indent
Yeah,
it and put
exactly.
a graphic, a bullet or whatever.
Like mentioned earlier, there's different levels. There's 0, which is basic, 1 standard, 2 advanced, 3 expert, 4 internal. Internal is never visible in the user interface, you can't choose it. It's just some stuff that needs persistence in XBMC, but we don't really want the user to change it. Expert, we initially thought this for advanced settings, if we ever manage to merge that with the new setting system. If we settings that we really want to hide, only to be visible if the user chooses to. And yeah, there's some discussion about merging the others. Yes. There's a default value. We had this in the old system. The problem was you couldn't access it. Once you changed the value, you couldn't reset it to the default value, which is also a problem if you do sometimes updates and you have to reset a value because you changed the way it works, the setting. You couldn't do it. There was a problem with the, I think with the scrapers. We changed them because the old one was broken.
Yeah.
But it simply, you had it in a definition, but the Gui setting XML still contained the broken one, and it was the default value was overwritten. There was no way to change back to the default value, and every new installation was broken.
So we are now able to push an add-on and change the default scraper,
Yes.
for example.
And you can, in the user interface, you can choose reset all the visible settings. If you played around and you fucked up, so you just said reset and you get all the default values back before you had to know what the default value was.
But we cannot. It would be nice if we could push a settings update or something to change the values. If we say, okay, we fucked up that setting in our release,
Yes?
we could be able to push out some sort of add-on that fixes those settings.
Change the default value settings?
Yeah, that's possible. I think it comes maybe later. No, I think I've covered it in the slide. You can specify in the settings XML, you update XBMC and you specify this setting needs to be updated.
But not with an XBMC update, but just push out an add-on.
Push the XML files via an add-on.
Yeah. So
Yeah, but the XML files are in the installation folder, so you probably can't change it.
But you can push the override for the settings XML. Can't you?
Or we can, with this, if we fetch it, we can do it through Python. But
No, it's not loaded from a user data.
Alright.
It's always loaded from system settings,
Right.
something. Yeah,
Or we could push out an update that overloads the profile of that one.
Yeah, just do it in a pointer base.
Yeah. For those two. That would have been a good idea.
ideally those as well.
Well, it's really broken, and fixing it
Yeah.
would be part of the point update, right?
Well,
Just we
you
want to
notice
fix it.
on Android it doesn't get updated. You notice that?
Yeah.
If you update Android, you won't get the new settings file. So that's something. I don't know what the problem was. I made a tick for it.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Got it brought down?
No. I added uni or villa. So if you the settings files change and it didn't get updated,
Yeah.
you still have the old settings files and something's not working there.
So it's an in-scope issue.
There's
Yeah,
this
something
issue.
it doesn't overwrite the.
It's a problem of the APK installation
Yeah.
process.
But then this is a problem for all the files. We basically,
Yeah.
if you change
Yeah.
DLL, but
Yeah.
you keep the name or a library file, you're basically screwed. Yes.
Well, on Windows I said it's on Windows it deletes the whole system.
Yeah, but on Android you're screwed.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you want to. Yeah, what's the reason? It's something in the folder where the settings are saved, I guess. It's some sort of folder which is retained during APK installation. It's retained from the former installation. So somehow.
It's another problem.
We should, yeah.
It's a bug.
Yeah.
It's a bug.
No,
I don't think it's your problem.
Yeah,
It's
not your fault.
Peeves will fix it.
No problem.
Yeah, but APK, what do you like? Make target now, so I would do it.
No, it's not isolation. It's all the new APK.
Does it do that, or does it never overwrite when it makes the directory that makes APK?
No, it doesn't look like when you install it.
Right,
New APK, yes.
Yeah,
but all this stuff gets copied to a temporary directory, and then we make the APK go to the temporary directory.
Yeah. So there might be the make processes.
It might be in there.
It's the making store, yeah.
A lot to invest in.
So it's just,
Continue.
but that would be unlikely, I think.
You know,
Yeah.
it's pretty hand-coded, scary stuff.
Okay, well, you also get a control tag where you can specify how the user interface control should look like. You can say I want a spinner, or I want a list, and you get a select list, a pop-up, or you can say I want an input field for text or for number or whatever. You can specify some constraints like ranges, minimum 0, maximum 50, step size 2. Or actually specify a list of valid values like 1, 2, 5, 10, 15, something like that. And you can specify dependencies between settings. You can say this setting is only enabled if the other setting has the value X, or if it doesn't have the value Z or whatever. You can also hide settings depending on the value of another setting. You can also do all this based on some callback method. You can specify check X, and then you write the C++ method check X, and you do the code in there that returns true or false, and then you can dynamically show, hide, enable, disable settings. Here's an example. It's the select action for video. You say it's level 1, so it's standard. The default value is 1, which is play or resume. And then in constraints you specify which values are valid, which you will get in the spinner. You specify you want a spinner, it will show a string. And these, the values are 0, 1, 2, 3, and every value has a label which is displayed in the user interface. So this is basically what a setting kind of looks like right now. I think it's pretty good, pretty readable. Maybe it's just me. Yeah, the implementation is broken down into 3 parts. We have the settings library, which is almost independent of XBMC. There's some dependency like the tiny XML wrapper of XBMC because of the VFS stuff, and some other utility classes like string utils, which could be broken out, and the whole library could be separated from XBMC. Then there's the settings integration code and the user interface integration code, which are both XBMC specific. Through this separation you can fix one thing without breaking the other. And especially the Gui integration is completely separated from all the other logic. There's really only displaying stuff, updating stuff in the user interface, nothing else, no extra action that happens when you change a setting or nothing like that. The settings library has lots of classes which have no interest to XBMC. And there's C setting, which is the base class for all setting types, where you have stuff like visibility, which is available to all settings. Then you have the type-specific classes, bool, int, number, string, and action, which just have extra attributes, which are then visible in the XML files. You can implement custom setting types simply by deriving from C setting, and then you register it with the setting system, and you can use it like a predefined setting type. In our case, this is C setting path and C setting add-on. I basically did this to keep the settings library code clean of XBMC code. The add-on stuff is very XBMC specific, and I wanted to keep that out of it, so you can specify any new kind of setting type that you need, might want. There's the C settings manager, which is not a single implementation. You can have as many as you want. This is important for profiles. In the old system there was a pretty bad hack to get the global instance in a new instance. So you can load or create a new profile. With this you don't need any such hack. You just create a new instance of the old settings manager. You initialize it and you write code. It's the only interface between XBMC code and settings library, so everything goes through there. The settings integration in XBMC is C settings. It's kind of a singleton implementation. There's a singleton instance, but you can still get a new interface, a new object independent of that singleton object. It's the singleton because we use it everywhere in XBMC, so it makes sense to have C settings, get, and you have that instance that everyone else uses as well. But for the other cases where you need a clean object, you can still do that. It initializes the settings library. It means loading the settings.xml and all the other platform-specific XML files. It registers some settings types, C settings add-on. It registers the requirements like has0, conf, has, dx, which are all XBMC specific, and other stuff like condition and callbacks, which I'll come to later. It loads the setting values from GUI settings, advanced settings. It's basically a wraparound C settings manager, hiding away all the stuff and like register callback, which is of no interest to the rest of the code. The Gui integration is a complete rewrite of C GUI Windows settings category. I basically threw away everything in there because there was so much clutter in there. I tried to do it step by step and then I gave up. I threw everything away and did it from scratch. It uses C settings to get the categories, the group settings, so we can build the user interface. And it uses the control definition from the XML to know how a setting should be represented in the user interface. We have no question. It's basically completely generic code. So it simply reads the list of categories and creates the user interface. It reads the list of settings and creates the controls. It's not completely generic because the list of user controls is limited. The supported list of user controls. This could be changed to also be extendable, so you can say we also want multiple checkbox list or something like that, which might not be supported in the settings library, like similar to the custom settings types, but it's not like that right now. The most important stuff is there's no code specific to any setting in there, so everything works for every setting. There's iSetting callback, which is the main interface used if you change a setting, you want to do something. So you implement the iSetting callback interface, and you have to register that you want to be notified about updates to setting X, Z, and whatever. You put together a list and say, if one of these settings changes, call this implementation. And in there you have one of these methods, you have onset and changing, which is called when a setting is changed, and you still have the possibility to say, no, this is not good. For example, you try to start the web server, but something is broken, you have an invalid port or whatever. So the setting can't be changed to active, it has to be changed back to inactive. So you can try to start a web server, and if it doesn't work, you say no. And then it doesn't change. Then you have onsetting changed, which is called after every callback confirmed that the new value is valid. And there you can do a lot of action. You can, a lot of settings use this to actually do something like change the skin, or I don't know. Then there's onsetting action, which is for action settings which basically don't have a value. They just do something like update library. Doesn't need any values stored in the GUI settings XML. It just needs something triggered, the library update or the library clean or something like that. I just did this because first I had it in onsetting changed, and I thought, the setting didn't really get changed, it just got triggered, so I added another.
So onsetting changing is what it's called?
Sorry?
When they click that, the onsetting changing gets called? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
And if everyone confirms that the value is okay,
yeah.
onsetting change gets called.
Yeah, but onsetting action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only if you click a button like update library, only onsetting action is called.
Okay, so you can't...
Because there's no value,
Right.
you can't reject a value because there is none.
So it's not a setting, actually.
Yeah, it's not really a setting, but
It's just a button.
it kind of has to go in that user interface list, so it is represented as a setting, but it doesn't have a value.
Yeah.
It's just a button, basically.
So if you wanted to do something conditionally, you'd have to do that based on like the enable disabled status.
Yes.
So, like, if you wanted to have the update library only be valid if it actually
Yes.
come along.
Exactly. And then there's the onsetting update, which is called, if you start XBMC and it realizes, oh, this is a new version, and you have specified in the settings definition that this setting needs to be updated. This is called, and you can do with the setting whatever you want. You can reset it to the default, you can get a new, better default value for the specific system, or you can change the name of the setting. That's also possible. And then there's all settings properly changed, but this is only really needed for the user interface integration, like if the visibility state changes or if the enable state changes, you don't really need that anywhere else. So here's a quick overview of if you want to add a setting, what do you have to do? You specify the setting in settings.xml or linux.xml or wherever you need it, as detailed as possible for your own interest. You write a new iSetting callback implementation, or you extend an existing one, and to do whatever needs done if the setting changes. You register it in the setting system so that it knows when to be called or for what setting to be called. You can optionally, if you can register option fillers like dynamic lists, for example, the resolution. We don't know the resolution at compile time, so you call a method which puts together a list of resolutions, which is called an option filler. Conditions like has, zeroconf, has, GL has, add-on setting, and these are C++ methods which are called dynamically.
So we have an initialize options filter. Is there an equivalent initialize settings fillers that allows you to inject settings dynamically?
I'm not 100% sure if there is a method, but basically if you want to inject a setting, you write a new settings.xml file and you pass it in if you initialize the system. So if you want to do this with add-ons, the add-on has to prepare this file and say inject this on load, and they get injected then. You can't do it right now on runtime. You have to have the file beforehand.
Okay.
But it could be added theoretically. And then you sit back and watch the magic happen. Yeah, there's also lots of things I left out. My initial presentation was much longer, and I threw everything away. I mentioned the requirements as Eurocon, the more complex requirements possible. There are static and dynamic conditions like does this add-on have settings or not to show a button or hide a button or whatever. The dependencies I already mentioned earlier. Updating settings I mentioned as well. The option fillers. There's also settings handlers for the files like profiles.xml and all that stuff. Subsettings. Yeah, there's an example for everything in the code, except for the visibility stuff because I added that recently. And yeah, hopefully you know how to reach me if everything doesn't work or if you have a problem with the system, if you try to add a new setting and you're lost. Yeah, at the end we have more flexibility in specifying the settings, in writing the code. Yes, everything is separated. The user interface is completely dependent of the rest of the code, so changing something in CGUI Windows settings category won't break the setting itself, which was very easy in the old implementation. Yeah, the whole user interface integration is much easier. It can be made accessible, it isn't yet, but it can be made into JSON RPC, to Python. I don't know what else there could be. Yes, and as already mentioned, there's a lot of discussion about how to integrate the settings levels, which settings levels should be there, which settings should have which level.
Custom levels.
Sorry?
Custom levels. For each user.
Yeah, why not? Some ideas I have on my to-do list, which I threw away for the future. Yeah, turn the whole settings library into an own project, independent of XBMC. Maybe it can be used somewhere else, but even if it isn't, it's still easier to maintain if you don't have to care about any dependencies that XBMC, if you have an XBMC. Ideally, I would like to combine CGUI Windows settings category and CGUI dialog settings, which is basically used by add-ons, so that add-ons can use the same setting system as XBMC. I don't know how it works right now. I've never written an add-on, so but I once looked at it.
It works pretty
It's
well.
It's an easy problem.
Yeah,
Similar to what we have
over
now.
here.
It's not the only problem is you cannot depend on another category.
No.
You can only depend on the settings within the same
Yeah,
category.
yeah.
There's
It's
only
basically just a cracked version.
okay. Yeah, you have basically two kinds of user interface integration codes,
Yeah.
which almost do the same but are completely differently written. So ideally, this would just be one implementation. It would work for both. Yeah, allow add-ons to inject settings like, for example, the subtitle add-on could inject a specific setting into video player category to choose a default language or whatever. And so it's more integrated into XBMC, so it doesn't seem like a separate part. Yeah, that's also what I said. Make the user interface control definitions extendable from XBMC. Right now there's a fixed list of supported types like list, spinner, button. Yeah, then if you need something else, you have to hack both XBMC and the settings library. Ideally, you only hack XBMC. Yeah, I think that's all I have. Oh, yes. Questions? Too much information.
So, right now, is it independent enough so that, you know, if we ever had the mythical binary add-ons working, we could update just settings as a binary add-on?
Not yet, no. But
What we gain from that?
Yeah, I don't think we
might as well push a new update. And
You're
that's
hitting it to download 100 gigs.
and it's a bit the same like, okay, push out an add-on update which updates the settings. It's about the same.
The problem basically is if you add a new setting, you also need to change the XBMC to use that
Yeah.
setting. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to add it.
So recompile.
The only reason would be if you fuck up
Yeah.
a setting and you have to fix it. But yeah, then you just make a new release because
And you shouldn't do merging.
Because we fucked up something else.
you had a question?
Yes, about levels.
Yes.
One idea I had was, and I think someone even mentioned it earlier, a settings system that learns from the current install. With I submitted a pull request for this for dynamic levels, where the default settings that the user sees are particular to that user's hardware and setup. Kind of a settings system that morphs to make it as convenient for the user as possible, that hides irrelevant settings and shows the more relevant ones dynamically. Just an idea I had.
Yeah, you made the pull request.
Also easier for
Someone
the
wasn't in favor of it, but I don't know who.
Well, we just don't have any
Real need.
exactly no need.
Yeah, I think it
Yeah.
was for the CEC.
Yeah.
Adapter, yeah. Where you show the
Right,
settings.
so-
if you have a CEC adapter, you hide it if you don't have one.
Yeah, exactly. One example, a CEC adapter, I would consider settings for changing that to be used by advanced users if they don't have a CEC adapter. If they don't have one, there shouldn't be any need for the casual user to change these settings. However, once it gets plugged in, then the casual user would want these visible.
Wouldn't that just be, like, if I understood this presentation correctly, wouldn't that just be implementing a has CEC?
No.
No.
You
It's
combine it
condition,
with
the
ASCII,
label is
you need
conditional.
that.
That's the difference, right?
Exactly, yeah. The
But
visibility.
You said you can make another method.
You can, right now you can hide it completely,
Yes.
but what he wanted to do was have different levels. Not hide it completely, but still be
Just
available,
Right, right.
but show it better if you have a CEC adapter.
Yeah, if you plug it out, the settings disappears.
Well,
Yeah.
the thing about that is Lars wants to move those to binary add-ons anyways on the peripherals, so we'll gain there anyway.
Yeah, there goes the
Well,
one neat policy
we'll
of the
have
thing
the
out.
add-on.
There might be others, I don't know. I'm not going to put
Well,
any thought into it.
why would we have a situation where we would still want access to the setting, even if it was more hidden, if we don't have that device or whatever? Like in the CEC example, if you don't have a CEC adapter plugged in, why would you want the setting there at all? Even if it was more buried.
Maybe it's temporarily unplugged.
Oh.
That's the only thing I can think of. It could be the case where you don't need it.
I think the counter argument from Lars was that if you ever go in there, you don't have the CEC adapter plugged in and it's not visible, you don't look for it there anymore because you were there, there was no setting for it, even if you don't have it.
Right.
And then next time you search somewhere else because you didn't see it before.
I'll do a lot now.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be interesting. A search function for settings where, let's say, you want to change the pass-through settings on your audio receiver. You could just type like audio pass-through, and then all of those options would be dynamically populated in one area.
You just have to do it in the user interface integration. You can get the list of settings. You just have to look through it, compare tables or whatever.
Google Chrome does this, and Google Chrome does it well.
Yeah, you need the labels.
Yeah,
Those
labels.
labels-
Any
IP that has complex settings has it.
And the explanation, labels and the
Yeah.
settings.
Because you need to have it in the user's language, not in the settings we name it.
Yeah, the problem is user won't search for
Yeah,
cache
let's
movie,
try
will
that.
search for, I want that my sound sounds better.
Then you have to put in the description if you enable paths, your sound gets better.
Wrong script.
Just having a, yeah,
I think that was bad, so what can it change?
Hey, I'm gonna interrupt everybody real quick. Did everybody fill this out?
Count the number?
No? I did not. So we have 3, okay.
I didn't get it, is when the setting is exposed to Python and JSON, do we have a way to restrict it? To say settings are a few settings are just restricted for XBMC to change and not from the outside world. It could be for the security side,
Only-
for sensitive settings.
No, only the internal settings that are visible to the user anyway.
But you can, yeah, if you base an RPC, you could build a web server and lock yourself out of you.
Or yes, but you can't say only allow change level 1
Same keyboard.
But that's the security. That's a problem we have everywhere. For JSON RPC, you can shut down anyone with access to the website can shut down your computer.
Do we have the possibility to limit settings just to the XBMC core? Do we change the area not from the outside world?
It's not exposed yet, so.
Did it say I expose it or I don't expose it?
Right now, no.
But if I would have that.
Yeah,
It's just an additional flag and say yes, expose it. And,
Yeah, it's just additional. It's about
Yeah, things like passwords and then we've got a few password settings in there, right?
yeah.
So you probably don't want like just run an add-on that's just get settings, password, and then just hopefully they put that on YouTube add-on or whatever, and, fire that off to some website. And suddenly a bit of a list of passwords. Well, I guess there's easier ways to get a list of passwords.
It was possible for the HTTP API to get all the.
Well, I guess if they really want to get it, they'll just read the XML.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's out of our hands, we won't allow that in.